Reptiles, such as this alligator, and birds, and mammals are classified together as amniotes. Now, they certainly seem different, and sometimes saying the relationship between them would be difficult. And the main reason for that is such an enormous amount of time has passed since they shared a common ancestor. And so we often failed, to appreciate just the length of time, say about 100 million years it took between the point where there were the first amniotes to when there were the first mammals, and then even the, quote, age of mammals, which begins 65 million years ago. Say another 120 million years passes before then. And so the enormous expanse of time, which has separated these groups, has allowed them to modify their various lineages separately. So if one were to go back to the first amniotes in the Carboniferous, they would be the ancestors of reptiles, birds, and mammals. But then shortly after the very first ones, there would be a lineage of the synapsids, which arose, whose only descendants today are mammals. So they were reptiles, but no reptilian group descends from them. And if you look at first, they were, almost entirely reptile. But even at the beginning, you could notice, wait, here are some traits like the hole for the jaw muscles, or the canines, or the shape of the skull, et cetera, which were traits that no modern reptile has, but which mammals do. And so these first mammal-like reptiles, the pelycosaurs, starting in the Carboniferous, they then start to have a few mammalian features. Jump forward in time to the Permian period, and then another group develops called the therapsids. The therapsids have even more. So, even more mammalian features, including at least some advances towards being warm-blooded, according to the number of, say, blood vessels in the bones, which are suggestive of this. So, the therapsids were reptiles, but they start to look more mammalian. They have more mammalian features than the pelycosaurs did. Now, they live for tens of millions of years. And so by the time you get to the advanced therapsids, some of them are actually looking dog-like. In their overall form, they are still reptiles. But once again, they are starting to accumulate mammalian features. Right before the mass extinction, then at the end of the Paleozoic, a new group evolves from the therapsids called the cynodonts, which have even more in terms of mammalian features. These survive into the age of dinosaurs in the Mesozoic era. And I have videos that go through all of this as just a very quick introduction into the diversity of mammals alive today. But so, for example, mammals are warm-blooded. To do this, they lost their lower ribs, their lumbar ribs, so that their lungs could expand more and push their guts out with each breath. That allowed them to support a higher metabolism. So while that helps mammals be warm-blooded today, it was the reptile ancestors of mammals which evolved that trait. Mammals can eat a lot and breathe a lot because they have a separation between the oral and nasal cavities. So they have this hard palate which separates these, whereas most other animals have to choose. Do you eat or do you breathe? Because if you just have one space, you can't do both. So mammalian warm-blooded metabolisms need an awful lot of oxygen to support this. And they also then need an awful lot of food. But thanks to this hard palate, they can breathe more and chew more than reptiles. But once again, it was the mammal ancestors, which were reptiles, which evolved this feature. Mammals have to process their food more efficiently. And so therefore, they need to be able to chew their food, something that most vertebrate groups don't do. And they chew their food using cheek teeth, which are specialized for chewing that. There are matching surfaces, which then allow for occlusion when the jaws are closed. The teeth touch, and they have matching surfaces which can rip apart the food. And so it's advances like these, which then allow modern mammals to have the warm-blooded metabolism which we associate with them. But once again, these had evolved over 100 million years in the ancestors of mammals. By the time the Mesozoic era was reached, this was starting 250 million years ago, there were cynodonts, and then later in what's called the Triassic period, there would then be mammals. So mammals are an ancient group. The first ones arising shortly after the first dinosaurs. However, for a long time, they were, just very small, rodent-sized members. Now, when I say rodent-sized, I don't mean rodents. Rodents would be a later group. These were simply the size of rodents and probably nocturnal, as are a large number of mammals today. So mammals are ancient, but for the longest time, they didn't really accomplish much. So for about 120 million years of the Mesozoic era, there were mammals that evolved into a large number of groups, virtually all of which are extinct today, but of which 3 have survived. And so if we were then to talk about the if we were to then talk about modern mammal diversity, the first thing we have to then discuss is that from the first ancestral mammals of the Triassic period, we don't have any of those, but there is one lineage which arose shortly after these early mammals. So the early mammals probably, still had a number of primitive reptilian features, like they would have been egg-laying. They would not have, been as good at being warm-blooded as the later groups. And when we consider the most primitive group of mammals alive today, this would be the monotremes. They are still egg-laying. So here you can see the echidna, that is an egg-laying mammal from Australia. Likewise, the duck-billed platypus. They are descendants from a very early branch of mammals. So of all of the mammal groups in the Mesozoic era, only 3 have survived till the modern day. And this is a representative of one lineage. Now, it's a mammal, right? But it still has a number of primitive features like laying eggs, having a cloaca, which is a common opening for the urinary, reproductive, and digestive structures. In males, the testes don't descend into a scrotum. It has a more primitive shoulder. So we could go through a number of traits that these monotremes, a very early branch in the mammalian tree, possess. Later in the Mesozoic, there were mammals which then modified their reproduction to give live birth. Now, in a sense, that's not that special. I mean, many sharks give live birth, many snakes give live birth, many lizards give live birth. So live birth isn't unique to this group, but as far as we can tell in mammals, it only evolved once in what are called the Therian mammals. Now, the Therian mammals of the Jurassic period then gave rise to 2 groups, the marsupials and the placentals. The marsupials spread all throughout much of the world, but they thrive more on the southern continents, and then that is where they were maintained. Now, today we certainly have many marsupials in Australia, such as koalas, kangaroos, Tasmanian devils, wombats, etc. But in the past, there were far more. Even in the recent past, the Tasmanian wolf became extinct. South America still has marsupials, opossums, and small rodent-sized animals. But in the past, there were, a far greater diversity, including some which look like saber-toothed cats or even bear-sized, etc. So marsupials were once more rich than they are today. But then when placental mammals evolved, these are mammals which give birth in a more advanced state. This would include the carnivores, the cats, the dogs. It would include rodents. It would include elephants, whales, bats, primates. And so most mammals alive today are placental mammals, and their success then, helped to limit then the marsupials and probably the monotremes as well. And so when we consider mammalian diversity, that's the first lineage that if we go back into the Mesozoic era, out of all of the lineages, 3 survived to the modern day. The egg-laying monotremes in Australia, and then the live-bearing therian mammals, which we can split into the marsupials, common in Australia, but also having opossum and rodent-sized representatives in South America, and then the North American opossum, which migrated north. But then most mammals belong to a third group known as the placental mammals. Because then mammals are descended from the first mammals, then they share features which non-mammals have. So there are features that all mammals have. There are features which the therian, the live birth mammals have. There are features which the placental mammals have. And I have a number of videos on anatomy. And so if you were to consider the nervous system, the digestive system, et cetera, you could, find, the mammalian traits, the therian mammal traits, the placental mammal traits, et cetera. Obviously for mammals, hair, being warm-blooded, these are certainly obvious traits. The mammary glands, which produce milk and provide that first source of nutrition for infant mammals. So these then would be obvious traits which unite all of the mammals, including the egg-laying mammals. But we could find traits which unite the mammals, then another group of traits for the therians, then another group of the placentals, in any system. So if we were then to consider, once again, the nervous system, digestive system, skeletal system, et cetera, we could list these. Now, the marsupials were doing wonderfully in South America, because South America was a floating island, for 60 million years and more. So the South America had been connected to Africa, but late in the Mesozoic it separated. And although today Central America unites the two Americas, that was something which happened maybe 4 million years ago. So for most of the Cenozoic era, for 60 million years, South America was isolated. And so it was a rich area for marsupials, which didn't have to compete with placental mammals. When Central America joined the two Americas 4 million years ago, so many placental mammals went north that it caused the extinction of lots of the marsupials in South America. But the opossum, which was native to South America, did then come north. So the opossum of North America is a recent addition to American mammalian diversity, having come from South America. It gives birth to young in an underdeveloped state, which then complete their development in the mother's pouch. So this opossum is more closely related to then kangaroos and koalas than it is to any placental mammal. So of the North American mammals, that is the most primitive branch, most unrelated to the others. The very first placental mammals still would have been small and primitive. So things like whales and bats and cows and cats and dogs, that was far in mammalian future. And if you were asking like what might some of the early placental mammals have looked like, give or take, well, the insectivores of today are a good representative of this, perhaps, because we still see many primitive traits in insectivores. So for example, we can still find a cloaca, a common opening between the urinary, reproductive, and digestive tracts, instead of having it separated to say an anus, a urethra, and a vagina. All three can empty into one common opening, as in reptiles and amphibians and fish. The testes still don't descend into a scrotum in males. The cerebrum of the brain can be smooth, and other traits. And so when we think of things like shrews and voles, which are insectivores, in addition to having roles in ecosystems, et cetera, they do, kind of give us a glimpse into what the first placental mammals would have looked like. Now, as we then consider the great diversity of mammals in this area, remember that many come out at night. All right, so rodents, bats, for example, these are the two biggest groups of mammals, and many of them we aren't as familiar with because they come out at night. Bats are amazing in their ability to fly, and what's essentially happened is that during embryological development, their fingers just keep growing and the skin between them stays entire. So bats have really long fingers, and the skin membrane between them then just allows them to fly. Now, the most primitive bats alive today, kind of the more ancestral group, they can come out during the day and they can feed on pollen, they can feed on fish, but within bats then a later development allowed them to do echolocation where they could emit high frequency sound waves through their nose, which then they pick up on the ear from their highly modified ears. And then as they hear how these sound waves are bouncing back, they then get an idea of the presence of insects around them, etc. Tragically, there is a fungal disease which causes white nose syndrome, which has led to the loss of millions and millions of North American bats in recent years, which is not only tragic for biodiversity in the bats, but given that a bat can easily eat its body weight in insects every night, certainly this then has had other impacts, such as on mosquito populations. This white nose syndrome is not only posing a threat to bats, in general, but also if we were to just consider, wildlife in general, and bats here being a convenient place to start, each species has a specific range. And, we often notice that there are generalists, which may be adapted to very large areas, but then there can be specialists, which, have a much smaller distribution. So there are some bats which are only known on certain islands or have very limited ranges, or actually can overwinter in a very small set of caves. And so thus there are many endangered bats on the endangered species list. And because they're nocturnal, our ability to monitor them is limited. So one of the reasons, once again, as I kind of shift, because mammals are so diverse, and obviously we could talk about, the diversity of, horses, of whales, of, armadillos, etc. But I kind of transition into the wildlife of the Northeast United States, where, my students might observe wildlife in, outdoors. And so in addition to the opossum and insectivores and bats, we do have a wild artiodactyl, the white-tailed deer. Now, artiodactyls are a big group. They're the even-toed herbivores. So when people speak of, quote, a cloven hoof is just two big toes with two big nails on which one can walk, as opposed to, say, a horse. A horse is essentially walking on one big finger, whereas, say, a cow, a goat, a sheep, a deer is walking on two primarily. So the two toe prints, for the cloven hoof, that's their adaptation. So these are large herbivorous mammals. Obviously cows, sheep, goats, successful in many parts of the world, but in the Northeast of the United States, the white-tailed deer is the sole representative which we can find. There you could see some fawns, some of the young deer. Here you can see a male, because in deer, with the exception of reindeer, where both genders can have antlers. In most deer, only males have antlers. At first, it is covered by skin and hair, which can be called velvet. But then this then can be scraped off, and then the antlers are composed merely of exposed bone. Now, these antlers are not primarily for defense against, coyotes or wolves, or else, both genders would have them and they'd keep them all year round. This is something which males possess during mating season. So males spar with each other um, prior to mating. And so deer are large, mammals which can be observed in the wild, second only to bears in areas like, this region of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. There are certainly larger deer like moose, but they would be found farther north. Most of the mammal diversity in the Northeast United States is in rodents. And that's not surprising because rodents are the most diverse mammals in the world. They even include some large forms like these rodent-sized capybaras or carpinchos from Latin America. In the past, there were certainly more diversity because, so here's the skull of a modern beaver, but there was once, a beaver species in North America, which could get to be 12 feet long. If you'll notice, the defining feature of rodents are these long incisors. If I were to try to eat what rodents do, well, that would be a problem because if I'm going to be gnawing on vegetative material like seeds and and plants or wood in the case of a beaver, very soon I would wear my teeth down to the gums. We mammals, we don't replace our teeth throughout our lives the way that reptiles do. And so therefore I would then starve because my teeth would be gone. Whereas rodents have these continually growing incisors, which allow them to be able to gnaw on more abrasive foodstuffs. But because their incisors continue to grow, they wear it down, it grows more, they wear it down, they can continue feeding throughout their lives. If you've ever kept a pet rodent, or if, park rangers, every now and then, if these teeth continue to grow, sometimes they can actually curve around and actually be putting pressure on an animal's neck. So it has these long incisors which continue to grow, and the teeth then have to be cut for the animal's well-being. And so rodents make up about half of all mammalian species. And so I know that when we think of mammals, we often think of, big ones like horses and cows and people and dogs and bears and elephants. But a typical mammal is a rodent. They represent about half of all mammals. And bats represent maybe 20% more. So if you want to think of a mammal, if you're not thinking of rodents and bats, well, then you're biased. You're perhaps placing an emphasis on like the large ones which come out during the day. Most mammals are small, which come out at night. And so thus, mammals in general have a very good sense of smell. We primates have lost that because our primate ancestors came out during the day. Mammals have a very high metabolism. You notice how quickly this rodent is breathing. Mammals communicate through smell. So there are glands, apocrine sweat glands, which produce body odor that contain pheromones in it that allow members of mammals to communicate with each other, etc. And the mammals in our area include a large number of mice, right? So there are different species there. Large number of voles. Now, in addition to just being important for biodiversity's sake, here is a vole underneath the ice, and you might notice it has a bit of a wound there. And that's because whether it be a short-eared owl or a harrier hawk, a predator attempted to capture this vole, and apparently in this case was unsuccessful. So because there's so much vegetative material around us, and then these mammals, mice, voles, and other rodents are so adapted to feeding on this vegetative material, there are a lot of rodents, but then they are important in food chains. So when we think of the predatory birds like hawks and owls, when we think of predatory snakes, especially things like rattlesnakes, which are actually have heat-seeking pits, which help them to seek out warm-blooded prey. And then all snakes, having lost their legs, are very good at going into burrows, like the burrows of rodents. And then also food chains for other mammals, such as foxes and coyotes. So rodents are not only important in and of themselves, but then also because of the large number of rodents, they then help to support food chains for many predatory animals. Groundhogs, woodchucks, these are synonyms, so they're not two different animals. So here we have the woodchuck being a larger rodent, which is native to our area. Interestingly, when the Americas touched, not only, so many animals went south. So if you were to go to South America today, there are deer there, there are, llamas, which are modified camels. There are tapirs, there are foxes. So many of these mammals were originally of North American origin. And then 4 million years ago, they went to South America, through this new land bridge. However, a couple did come north. The opossum is one example. Armadillos, which you might find in, say, Texas or Florida, that would be another example of a South American animal, which then was able to invade North America. But then porcupines would also be in that group. Porcupines are rodents. They have modified some of their hairs to be rigid quills that they could use in defense. And they were native to South America for the longest time, but when the Americas touched recently, about 4 million years ago, that they were able to come north. We have a number of larger rodents in our area. This would include muskrats. And now muskrats certainly feed on vegetative material, but many rodents are capable of being more omnivorous as well. And so very often you find lots of shells of freshwater bivalves, freshwater clams. So these muskrats can feed on them as well. Muskrats are very similar to the beaver, which is the largest rodent in North America. But the beaver then has a flattened tail, which then allows it to slap the water to warn other beavers in the area of any approaching danger. So beavers can feed on a lot of vegetation. They can feed on the inner bark of trees, which transport sugar, so therefore can be nutritious. But they can also then use trees to block water passageways, because beavers are very good at swimming. And so while they're in the water, they are relatively safe from predators like coyotes and the like. However, if they were to go out onto land, they're more vulnerable. But after a while, a beaver may have exhausted the supply of trees close to the water's edge, and they might have to go then farther and farther inland. But if they could then dam, say, a stream that floods the area, and now there's more vegetation which is within reach of which is in reach of the water. So it's a way of protecting themselves. There are a variety of squirrels which live in our area. There are the more common gray squirrels, and then also red squirrels. Red squirrels are more commonly found in coniferous forests with pine trees. Gray squirrels are more commonly found in deciduous forests, where they can feed on many sources of vegetation, but things like acorns and hickory nuts are major supplies for them. There is the small rodent known as the chipmunk. Chipmunks, once again, are an example of a rodent which is more omnivorous. All right, so certainly they eat lots of plant material, but they can also eat turtles' eggs and bird eggs and small animals. And so chipmunks have a more diverse diet than many give them credit for. And one of the interesting groups is we include rabbits with rodents, but their split with the rest of the rodents is so deep that many have argued, do we necessarily have to include them in the same order with rodents? And so while we do classify them as rodents, they are less closely related to other rodents than almost any other group. So this was an early split. Here you can see the elongated ears, which help them, hear potential predators. And so in the Northeast United States, just as throughout the world, rodents are the most common mammals and the most diverse in terms of species. And so if when we're studying, mammal diversity, the diversity of rodents would be important. So the order Rodentia has a great diversity of mammals in the Northeast United States. So once again, mammals can be broken into one group, say a class, but then into subgroups, and so there's the egg-laying mammals, the marsupials, the placental mammals. And then the placental mammals can be, broken into groups which we can call orders, although there are, suborders, infraorders, etc. Just as rodents were an order, Rodentia, and bats were an order, Chiroptera, then there is an order Carnivora, which includes carnivores. The largest carnivore in the Northeast United States and the largest mammal in the Northeast United States is the black bear. There are other bears throughout the world. This is the only one which lives in our area. Now, it is certainly a carnivore, but like many bears, it has a more omnivorous diet. So it is certainly capable of preying on animals. But black bears include, say, berries and ants as a major part of their diets as well. They're within the order Carnivora. The family Ursidae, which contains bears, is not the only family. And so there are a variety of other families, including the family of raccoons, which also includes the coati in Latin America. And so this is a smaller carnivore, once again, capable of eating a broad diversity of food items from, amphibians to snakes to rodents, but then also capable of including plant material in its diet as well. And dogs are carnivores. They belong to their own family Canidae. And in the wild in this area, one can find red foxes, gray foxes, which are a basal branch of the dog family tree, and then coyotes as well. And so these are carnivores, although once again, they are capable of including other members of other elements in their diet. Here you can see a young red fox coming out from its den. So these are carnivores in our area, as is the gray fox, which I have an image of in the next video. And then in addition to the dogs, here are some tracks of the coyotes. So I try to videotape coyotes, but the few that I've seen are gone shortly afterwards. So these tracks are about as good as I can get. But then there are other carnivores as well, because there are lots of things to eat in this world, many of them smaller. So skunks are carnivores whose musk glands can not only be used for communication among themselves, but also as a defensive mechanism, although it's really not that effective against their primary predator than the great horned owl, which lack a sense of smell. Some carnivores throughout the world have adapted to a more aquatic lifestyle so that they can feed on fish and other aquatic organisms. And so the otter would be an example of that. So there is a family of carnivores called Mustelidae, or the mustelids, and this includes the otters, the largest in our area, as you can see, adapted to aquatic life. In Brazil, there's an otter species which gets to be much larger, up to 5 feet in length. In addition to otters, there are other mustelids in our areas, such as minks and weasels. So they are a bit smaller. Minks can then also spend time near water. So the mustelids tend to have a more elongated body. So here you can see a mink here where it can feed once again on fish and more aquatic organisms. And so when we consider diversity, which has been, a focus of, the course that I teach, certainly mammals, being such an ancient group, have had opportunity then to have lineages of their family tree break in the distant past. And so there are fairly significant differences between, the egg-laying monotremes, the marsupials, and the placental mammals. The placental mammals are ancient, going back to the Cretaceous period. And certainly once the dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, there was, many vacant ecological niches for mammals to evolve diverse species. And so then, we have the rodents, the carnivores, and if we consider mammals throughout the world, obviously then there are primates and whales and the large hoofed mammals and armadillos and so many others. And so this has ended with a focus on the mammal diversity that one could observe in the wild in the northeastern United States. So in addition to the opossum, which is our marsupial, there are insectivores like shrews and moles. There are a diversity of bats, including endangered bats worth considering for that reason. There's a great diversity of rodents, which, as is typical with mammals, the most species-rich group of mammals. About half of all mammals are rodents. There are white-tailed deer, the artiodactyls native to this area, and there is a variety of carnivorous mammals, including bears, foxes, coyotes, raccoons, skunks, otters, minks, weasels, and others.